Hey everyone, in this video we're going to take a look at chapter 34 from book 5 of Caesar's de Bello Gallico. So you might remember that we're still in the middle of Ambiorix's revolt, and at this point we're really focusing in on the fort that I've got highlighted here, right up in the region of the Eburones, right, in Belgica here, right, in Belgium. We've had this rebellion. The Romans don't quite realize what's happening yet, but Ambiorix has lured the Romans out of this fort, and he's ambushed them, right? So we're in the middle of the ambush right now, where the Romans have gone into basically a valley. They're surrounded on all sides by Ambiorix, right, and his men. And in this chapter, you're going to see Caesar work his way through a description of the battle and sort of the tactics that Ambiorix is using. And it's a really interesting, interesting look at how Caesar uses his words and the persuasive style he's writing with, because he is going to praise Ambiorix, which is interesting itself. But he's also going to focus on the Romans and show that they're fighting pretty well too. Okay, so we'll unpack all that. But before we do it, like I always tell you, the first thing you want to do whenever you're reading through Latin is try to make sure you know the vocab. So if you could go through, do a little bit of pre-reading, make your own vocab list, or pull out a commentary, from De Bello Gallico, anything like that, excuse me, where you can get a list of words, maybe just even a list of the words you don't know. That's always the key, because it's really hard to read through if you just have no clue what the words are, what the vocab is. It's almost a non-starter. So get the vocab, practice it. Then the other thing you want to do is try reading this aloud, right? So whenever you read Latin, try to bring it to life. If you can find a classmate to read it to and then have them read it back to you, that would really help you work on your pronunciation, your speaking skills. I know personally, I was telling my videos, my pronunciation is nothing fantastic, and I've been teaching Latin for a while, so I always try to have my students work on their own pronunciation and give them resources so they can kind of understand the language better, right? It's meant to be spoken, so that would be something I'd always encourage you to do. And if you can have someone read it back to you, now you're working on your listening skills, right? So all those things are really great ways to help you understand Latin. You never want to shut them off. When it does come time for translation, I'd always encourage you to do the read and reread method. You've heard me say this before, but I think it works. So you read through the chapter, you write down any problem areas you might have, whether it's vocab, grammar, sentences, parts of sentences, whatever. Write it down. When you get through the entire chapter, go back and look at your list and try to figure out where you went wrong. If it's vocab, that's easy. Just look the words up. You'll be able to figure that out without too much trouble, right? Just practice some more. If it's something from, the grammar, maybe a commentary would help you, right? Try to look and see if there's something you can read from someone to help you through. So you're like, oh, I get it. Now I understand what that means. But one way or another, you try to look it up, whether it's verbs, whatever it might be. You try to fix those problems, and then you just repeat that process over and over again. And on the second, third, fourth time, whatever it is that you might need, it should click a lot better for you. And now you're able to read through it without having any problems. That's how you know that you're ready to move on. I know a lot of times we're reading De Bello Gallico in an AP Latin classroom, and you don't necessarily have a ton of time because it's a big curriculum and there's a lot to do. I get it. But if you can find that time, it really does help lock this into your long-term memory and not the short-term, because that's usually where my students in AP Latin tend to forget things, and then it comes time for the test and they don't remember what was happening, right? So I'd always encourage you to do that. But one way or another, work on that on your own. If you haven't done that yet, pause the video, go do that work. But if you're going to keep going, right, move forward, we're going to take it apart piece by piece and read through this chapter together, okay? So the chapter goes like this. And remember, you're starting in the middle of the ambush, like I mentioned, right? So the Romans are already getting attacked. But you have ad barbaris consilium non defuit. Okay, so it means the plan, the concilium, a plan was not lacking for the barbarians, meaning they had a plan. So Caesar had just said in sort of the previous chapter that the Romans have no plan, because you have Sabinus running around like a crazy person. He doesn't know what he's doing. Caught is trying to help and kind of organize everyone, but the Romans are very much caught off guard. Okay, so again, it's sort of like in stark contrast to the Romans. Then you have nam duces eorum tota acie pronuntiare userunt, ne quis ab loco discederet illorum esse praedam atque illis reservari quaecumque Romani reliquissent, proinde omnia in victoria posita existimarent. Okay, so that whole line, there's a couple pieces we can do. But it's saying, but the leaders, or their leaders, right, duces eorum, but their leaders on the entire battle line, right, tota acie. So it almost means like along the entire battle line. It's the ablative of sort of place where, right? And remember, that's sort of the fighting formation of the Gauls, that's who we're talking about here, not the Romans. They commanded pronuntiare, right? So it's saying that they ordered it to be commanded is kind of what's going on here. But they ordered that they command that nequis, that not anyone, Okay, so here is where you have, that idea that after words like ne, the ali disappears, right? So there's some that say things like after si, nisi, numen ne, all the alis go away, or ali takes a holiday, right? There's a bunch of different mnemonics to kind of help you with remembering that for the little jingle. But it's saying they ordered it to be kind of commanded, right, or announced it to be commanded, that not anyone depart, right? Nobody depart from their place, ab loco, from that place or from their place, meaning their spot in the battle line. Okay, so the Gauls are having the word be passed along: don't move, don't run away. Okay, and it's saying that the loot was theirs, right? Elorum esse praedam, right? So here we're starting this indirect statement, right? It's kind of going along with that indirect command we just saw with pronuntiare governing everything. But it's saying that the loot was theirs, right? So if they stay, they're going to be able to loot the Romans. Okay, so the loot was theirs, and for them, right, illis, anything quaecumque Romani, so anything which the Romans reliquissent, left behind, reservari, it was reserved for them, illis, right, is how you want to translate that. So it's saying whatsoever, right, this relative clause of characteristic, you could say. It's got the pluperfect subjunctive going with it. But anything that the Romans leave behind is praedam, it's loot for the Gauls. So in other words, Ambiorix is saying, hey, if you can stay and you can win this, think of all the stuff you can get. And remember, that kind of ties back into what we saw when the Romans leave their camp, because they're bringing all their sort of precious stuff with them. So this could be money, obviously weapons, armor, things like that. But there's a lot of loot, just stuff, which is kind of how it works in ancient warfare, right? You always loot the people that you kill. So there is sort of a monetary incentive we're seeing here for the Gauls to stay and kill the Romans. Okay, and then you have the proinde, right? So therefore, omnia existimare, right? So they thought that everything had been placed in victory, right? So in other words, they put all their hope into winning the battle, right? It is kind of the idea of the posita esse, right? So it's been placed on this idea that they're gonna win the battle and get to loot everything. Then we go on to the next line, and you have erant et virtute et studio pugnandi pares. Okay, so they were erant. It's talking about the Gauls again, right? And Ambiorix, they were equal pares, right? So it almost means like equal to us or equal to the Romans, right? Is kind of one way to think about it. Then you have the et virtute et studio. So you have the ablative of respect here. It's kind of going with how they're equal. So in respect to, right, virtute, virtue, and studio pugnandi, sort of like zeal of fighting, right? Their sort of desire for fighting is one way to think of it. Pugnandi there is the gerund, right? So it's a genitive gerund. So that's zeal for fighting, right? The enthusiasm for fighting. So Caesar comes out right away saying they're the equal to us, which is interesting because you wouldn't necessarily think that he would say that about his enemy, but it's true. They're very good warriors, and he's kind of acknowledging that here. Okay. Then you have nostri, right? Tametsi abduce et a fortuna deserebantur. Tamen omnem spem salutis in virtute ponebant, et quotiens quaeque cohors procurat, right, procurerat, there we go, ea parte magnus numerus hostium cadebat, rather. Okay, so you have our men, nostri, right? So our men, although they were deserted, deserebantur. So that's a great word to kind of throw in here. And Caesar's definitely making a comment about what's happening. So although they were deserted by their leader and by fortune, a fortuna. So I always find it interesting that you have duce there, the singular, because I mean, to me, it reads that he's calling out Sabinus and not Cotta. So when he says their leader, he's specifically putting the blame back on Sabinus. And I think it's interesting that he doesn't say their leaders, even though Cotta is there as well. He is very squarely putting it on this one man, so abduce. And by fortune is kind of another interesting, an interesting side note here, right? So it's sort of the personified, this goddess Fortuna, right, has deserted them. So they're in very tough shape. Fortune has abandoned them. Their leaders have abandoned them. And even though all this is happening, right, tametsi, you have, however, tamen, ponebant, they put omnem spem, all their hope, of safety, salutis, in virtute, in virtue, right? So they put all their hope of surviving and safety in their valor, in their fighting virtue. So it's another way of saying that even though they're abandoned by everyone, they have no sort of last resort. They don't give up. They just decide to fight harder. And I think that's a great comment Caesar's making for his men. And again, he will always praise his soldiers. That's what he's doing here, right? Every time he's always praising the virtue of his soldiers. Okay, and again, he's pointing out how bad their leader was right before that. Then you have and quotients, right? As often as any, quaeque cohorts, any cohort procurat had charged forward. So as often as a cohort kind of ran from the pack, ran out, charged forward, whenever that happened, ab ea parte, right, on that side or from that side, magnus numerus, a great number of enemies, hostium, cadebat, fell. So Caesar's saying that whenever one of the Roman cohorts charged out on that part of the battle or on that side of the fight, a lot of enemies fell, right? A lot of enemies, meaning the Gauls, right? And when he says cadebat here, it could mean falling, meaning like they're actually dying, but it also carries this idea of almost falling back, right? Sort of like retreating a little bit. And you're going to see it might make more sense to kind of interpret it that way too, based on what Caesar's going to describe that Ambiorix does. But either way, he's praising his men, saying that they're fighting really well, okay? Then you go on to the next part. You have quare anima adversa, Ambiorix pronuntiare jubet ut procultela coniciant, neo proprius accedant, et quam in partem Romani impetum fecerent, ... Right, okay, so we'll kind of take this in one piece. So you have the ablative absolute to start. You have quare anima adversa. So with this thing, this matter having been noticed, right? So in other words, once they realize that sort of the Romans are charging and fighting and all these different things, Ambiorix, right, so the leader, he jubet pronuntiare, he orders it to be announced. And notice how there's this tense shift here. You have jubet, he orders. That present tense, it kind of puts you right into the moment, right? So I kind of like that Caesar does this where he's shifting a little bit. But it definitely puts you into the moment of what's going on. Up until this point, it's been mostly imperfect, there we go, which is showing you that it's sort of ongoing action in the past, but now we're really in the moment. So you're kind of with Ambiorix. He orders it to be announced, that ut, right? When he says procultela coniciant, that they throw, so he orders it that his men throw their tela, their weapons, from far off, procul, right? So he's saying that Ambiorix orders his men to start chucking spears, arrows, whatever they have from a distance, right? Not fighting the Romans up close, right? And not near neu proprius accedan, and that they don't approach nearer. Right? So neu proprius accedan. Don't go close to the Romans is what he orders them to do. So stay back, throw your weapons, do not approach the Romans. Then it says, and, right, quam in partem Romani impetum fecerit. So in whatever part or what direction or part of the battle, the Romans made an attack, impetum fecerit, right? So in whatever direction they make their attack, something we're going to see now. We'll switch the gears. The line continues with cedant, and then you have this side thought of levitate armorum et quotidiana exercitatione, nihil eis nocere posse, rorso se ad signa recipientes insequantur. So in the direction the Romans make an attack, cedant, they should fall back. And again, this is tying into the previous line where we just saw, cadebat, right, that they were falling. Again, that's why I said you can take it almost as they're retreating, because that's what the order is to do here. So if you kind of combine the two lines we just saw, the continuous thought is don't go near the Romans, fall back a little bit, throw your weapons from a distance, and whenever the Romans do make an attack, the order is to cedant, to fall back, right, that they should fall back or they might fall back, right? And Caesar gives you sort of the side thought there by saying levitate armorum, because of the lightness, the levitate of their armor, of their weapons, right? Armorum, their arms, and quotidiana, the daily training, exercitatione, right? The daily training. So because of all this, nothing for them is able to be harmed. So again, Caesar here is praising the Gauls and saying they've been trained in this hit and run warfare. They're not going to get hurt, right? Because they're constantly training. They have these lightness, right? Lightness of arms, meaning they're fast. They can fall back and they're not going to get hurt because they're trained to do this, right? So they have this training of a hit and run style attack. And then he finishes the line with Rorsos. So again, you have Rorsos se ad signa recipientes insequantur. Okay, so it's saying again, they follow, right? So they fall back because of all their great training, they're not able to hurt. And again, they follow them, meaning the Romans, ad signa recipientes, the Romans retreating, recipientes, there's the present participle there, retreating to their standards, to their signa. It almost means they follow them while they're retreating to their standards, right? It's going with insequantur there, okay? So what's happening here, and that's the end of the chapter, by the way, but what's happening here is really interesting. You have Caesar praising the Gauls, praising their tactics and saying they're equal to us, but he's saying both sides are fighting really well, right? The Romans aren't giving up either. But I just wanted to give you a visual of what kind of interesting tactics Caesar's describing. You can see here, you have the circle of the Romans, kind of one way to think about it. It wouldn't be a perfect circle like this, but the Romans have gotten into that defensive formation. They're surrounded. And when one cohort charges out, which they were doing, right? The Romans would see the Gauls and try to press through. When that happens, they retreat a little bit. They fall back, right? So they're kind of luring the Romans into another area where they can be encircled, and now they throw all their weapons at them. This would be a pretty devastating tactic, because if the Romans are trying to break free of that defensive formation and actually fight and charge, you're going to be exposed from the back and the side to weapons, right? So it's very difficult if you don't have all your shields creating sort of a defensive square or circle. There's a very good chance you're going to get killed doing this, right? Meaning the Romans. So this is the style that we see the Gauls doing. They're not just mindlessly charging in. They do have a really good plan, and they're very well trained, right? Caesar just told you they have this daily practice. So they're catching the Romans in this hit and run style attack, and it's really showing that the Romans are in a brutally difficult spot. They can't stand still. They're probably going to get killed. When they charge out, they're getting kind of outmaneuvered by lightly armored foes who are throwing weapons at them. It's a really difficult position for the Romans to be in, okay? So just some questions to think about as we go. Like I said, we've talked about this a little bit, but you do want to notice that Caesar's giving credit to Ambiorix's plan, right? He does say Ambiorix has a really good plan, which is interesting. But at the same time, that line comes right at the start of the chapter. And because of the positioning of that line, it puts it directly in contrast with Sabinus and the Roman army, okay? So right before that, we had seen how everything's kind of going poorly for the Romans. Cauda is fighting, but Sabinus is running around with kind of no idea what to do, right? And that's sort of the direct contrast we see by starting with, hey, the Gauls do have a plan. Okay, because like I said, Sabinus seems to have no plan at all. The other thing that's interesting is Caesar is putting no blame on his men here, right? He's saying they're fighting valiantly, which is true, right? The Romans aren't just giving up and dying. So even though their commanders have no idea what's going on, Caesar is praising his men, which he will always do. He's never going to admit if any of them gave up. They might have, right? But in terms of Caesar, he's never going to say they didn't fight hard, because he's trying to praise his men. So here he's saying they fought valiantly and did their best. Their only fault is they were led by an idiot, right? And it kind of comes through very clearly here, where you see how well the Romans are described as fighting. It makes you wonder, could they have escaped or done something different if they weren't led by Sabinus and he didn't go in without a plan? That's kind of what we're left to think. The other thing you want to notice, and I mentioned this before, the imperfect tense shows up a lot in this chapter, and the effect of that is to show the ongoing struggle of the battle, right? And it's really interesting when he does change tense to present. It puts you really in the moment. So I've always found this chapter to be an interesting one to read, because it feels like you're there, you're with the men. It's kind of an intense chapter when you read about what's going on in this struggle, right? It's very much life or death for the Romans. The last thing I would say is that hit and run tactic of Ambiorix. It's a very, very good counter to the Roman legionaries. So they're really built for more of what I put here as a stand and fight battle. If you line up a Roman army, right, that has time and a battle plan against an enemy force, they almost always will perform really well. Where the Romans often get into trouble is when they're ambushed, right? We see Ambiorix here. You're going to see later on in the Teutoburg Forest, you're going to see that, that ambush also happening and taking out the Romans. You can see whenever they fight sort of enemies more on the eastern side. Like the Parthians, for instance, the horse archers give him problems. So I would say that in general, the Romans are not really built for this sort of like light, mobile, hit and run style tactic. It's not what they're great for, particularly when they're ambushed. So Caesar is praising Ambiorix and saying, hey, give him credit. He had a very good battle plan, which he seems to have done. So I think it's interesting how, again, Caesar's praising both sides. He's giving credit to Ambiorix, and at the same time, he's praising his own men, saying both sides are fighting really well. And lingering in the background is how much he doesn't like Sabinus and what he did wrong. Okay, so hopefully this translation made sense. There's not a lot in chapter 34, but there are some slightly tricky things kind of going on here. So if there's anything you think I went through too fast or wasn't clear on what I was saying, just put it in the comments below. I'm happy to fix it and kind of tweak as we go. But hopefully this gives you some confidence moving forward, and helps you understand the chapter a little bit better. And like I said, the best thing you can do is read this on your own. Do that read and reread method. Try to get really comfortable with it, and just use my videos as sort of a double check. So you always want to do the work first before you come to me. That way you can feel, do a little comparing and see what makes sense to you. Okay. But like I said, if you need anything, let me know. Otherwise, keep at it, keep practicing, and hopefully this is making more sense. Good luck.